those positions, while we talk about these references and these local landmarks, it'll be like, ah, I see now why I would be twisted one way, even though my brain is trying to convince me that I'm twisted another way. Okay? So obviously you can have your stuff out on the desk, but find an area like you could, this is like Southwest Airlines move about the country. Okay? So small groups, 2 to 4, and let's spread out and do some of these harder pelvic girdle stuff together. So that way we can really get a sense of what's happening for the test. Okay. On 2, ready? Great. Nice. I bet nobody's been watching NCAA basketball. That's why I got the brain fog this morning. True story. One year when I was your age, I finished 67th out of 150,000 in my ESPN bracket. That's when they just started. Now there's millions. I chose 3 of the final 4, the championship game and the winner, and I still came out 68th. And I'm like, I'm done. There's never, it's impossible to. All right, guys, first one. Here we go on the board. I would love, let's discuss. So let's say he starts off in anatomical position on the ground and he moves his pelvis to get into this new position. Let's discuss pelvic girdle rotation to get him here. And let's also talk about trunk position. Now, some of these illusions, it might look like it didn't move, and it didn't move could be an answer. But talk to me specifically about pelvic girdle rotation to get him to that picture and trunk motion to get him that into that position. And then finally, trunk position in that position. Discuss. Lindsay and I will float around, but I'm telling you, if you can move, it will really help you to see these concepts better. The carpets are clean, guys. They just put these in 1986. Yeah, so if you are done with the trunk and pelvis, I'm not rushing you. I want you to take your time because I think these are the things that make the light bulb go off. But we could have positional conversations about all kinds of stuff in that picture. We could have hip conversations, knee conversations, ankle conversations, shoulder conversations. All right, are we good? Does everybody have an answer for at least the trunk and the pelvis, and then we'll branch off of that. All right, the test, it's all in, well, sometimes people are like, what will you ask? And I'm like, I can ask anything. How I'll ask it, we can talk about, but I don't know what I'm gonna ask yet. I haven't written the test. So if I ask something like this, how must have the pelvic girdle rotated to get to that position? if he started off in anatomical, what would you say? How would the pelvis had to have rotated? Left transverse from the pelvis's perspective, how the pelvis rotates. Okay. How must have the trunk rotated while the pelvis is spinning left? In order to keep his shoulders on the ground, the pelvis had to rotate the other direction. Does that make sense? So the trunk would have rotated to his right. Cap and bottom. If both of them spun to the left, he wouldn't have any change in position. Does that make sense? And if his pelvis spun to the left and his trunk spun to the left, he'd be facing the floor. Trunk and pelvis spinning in opposition in this case, okay? We're all good? So the position of his trunk, he is twisted to his right. How do we know? Stuff like this can get confusing. What are the clues that I'm teaching you as kinesiology detectives? How do we know? You're in a conversation with another professor or in another group of people or in therapy school. And they're like, well, wait, I don't understand. How is he twisted to the right? You say, well, what are the landmarks I taught you with the trunk? Sternum and hip, right? Because the only way his sternum could be looking at his right hip is if he was twisted to the right. That's the only way. If his sternum was lined up with his pubis, he wouldn't be twisted to the right. The only way to be in this position is for the trunk to be twisted to the right. Make sense? All right, while we're on it, shoulders would be abducted. We're only going to talk about obvious ones. His right knee is flexed. His left knee is slightly flexed. I wouldn't ask a little bit. What about his right hip? We could say his right hip is flexed, and there's a good case that he's horizontally adducted, right? Coming across. Sternum, nothing significant because it looks like his chin is kind of lined up with his sternum a little bit. Nothing obvious there. His right ankle looks to be a little plantar flexed. Again, I'm not going to ask little bits. It's going to be obvious stuff. Everybody understand this example? Are we ready to go on to another one? All right. Here is a famous Campbell question. Not and remember, we talked about why this is confusing because of the concept of the up. All right, I'm going to shut up because I don't want to give you too much. I want to see if you can apply your knowledge. All right. Shoulders, most of the time, travel in a combination of sagittal and frontal. Okay. So what we're going to have right here, we're going to say, let's have a sagittal question. And then we could also have a frontal question after. So what I mean is, even though the motion is probably going to be somewhere in the middle, let's just talk about this. Because when you do sagittal and frontal at the same time, you get this. Just like when you go north and east at the same time, you go northeast. So there's some combination here that's going to be happening. Let's just talk about the sagittal component of that. Whatever component of sagittal, that's what we'll have this conversation. Then we'll go to the frontal conversation after. Okay. So in other words, from shoulders, I want a flexion extension conversation, and then we'll have the ab and adduction conversation after. Elbows, shoulder, scapula. Go. Shoulder. Left to right. Left to right. And then we'll go right to left. All right, we're good. I think. These are good. Yes. We're good. All right, you guys. Let's go over it. And again, if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to ask. One of the reasons this question will get students on the test is because it's a classic mix of global versus local reference concepts and words. So when they say, let's do a pull up, that's a global reference because you're pulling yourself, your center of mass up. However, your scapulus, especially when doing so, is actually going to be downwardly rotating, right? In other words, if this was a lat pull down, you'd be doing the exact same motions as if your hands couldn't move and you pulled yourself up. So that's where sometimes these exercises have these global references, downs and ups, that don't necessarily match up with the local references that our joints are doing, okay? So coming up, if we're in the sagittal, that would be bilateral shoulder extension, bilateral elbow flexion, bilateral scapula downward rotation to help get that chin over the chest. I'm sure the scapula could help by depressing. But does that make sense? Like it's all of the downward things with the fixed hands that's making your center of mass go up. But the motions are the exact same as a lat pull down. I mean, heck, you're working the same muscles, right? So if we go down, if we lower herself down, that's actually all of the upward things happening in our arm. So you'd have like the shoulder flexion component, the elbow extension component, the scapula elevation and upward rotation component while she's lowering herself down. Does that make sense? What's that? Not significantly because of her position of her body. The retraction would really be great if she was like here, like imagine if she were, let's say there was a bar, and she was like her body position was here, and she was pulling herself up. That would be a good way to use retraction for extra. But because she's so vertical, think of it like this. Because she's so vertical, retraction would kind of help with motion that would be perpendicular to what she needs, if that makes sense. So if she repositioned her body like this, then there would be much more of a retraction component that could help her get up. But because she's so strong and so vertical, it wouldn't be significant. Great question. All right, y'all ready for another one? I'll give you another pelvic girdle. Like, feel free if you guys in your conversations you want other things, let me know. All right, you guys, let's take a look at this one. I don't know if I'm going to do it this time, but I have used this picture in the past. Now, I think this is a good example because there's a lot of stuff going on. It gets overwhelming. Good Lord, where do I start? Start wherever you want. We analyze joint by joint. You want to analyze the left hip, the right hip, the knees, the pelvis, the trunk, shoulders. However, I'm going to steer the ship and I'm going to give you certain things that we'll emphasize for this picture. So let's look at specifically what type of pelvic girdle rotation would occur mostly from left to right. And let's analyze the hip rotation at the left hip. Now remember, when I say the left hip, it's always the person that we're analyzing, right? It's their hip, it's their humerus, it's their sockets, it's their, all their stuff. So let's do pelvic girdle, let's do left hip, and for funsies, let's analyze cervical motion. And again, there may not be anything. It's part of the fun. So I'm giving you three. Out of all the things we could talk about, I'm giving you three important ones that I will ask to some extent on the test. Pelvis, left hip, cervical, go. If you're recreating, remember to mimic the person. So in other words, if he's batting right-handed, don't do left-handed. Yeah, all right, guys, here's a hint. Here's a clue. If I have a basketball in my hand, okay, and I spin it in the transverse plane, wouldn't the motion of my hand also be in the transverse plane? So in other words, if the basketball is spinning in the transverse plane, my hand that's spinning it would also have to spin in the transverse plane. Just as a hint in terms of what I'm looking for, what spun the pelvis from the hip? Continue. All right, you guys. Pelvic girdle rotation. Left transverse pelvic girdle rotation. Cool. Left hip internal rotation is what predominantly spun the pelvis. The right, we talked about it before, the right hip is actually going to be going along for the ride. It's like a kickstand on a bike. Because the best rotation, or I say the best, the most efficient rotation is pure when it's about one axis. So like in class, I use the example how when figure skaters are trying to spin as fast as they can, they pick a foot, they pick and they pick one skate to go super fast. So it's very similar. We're going to pick one leg so that our whole body rotates about that one axis, and the back leg goes along for the ride to serve as a kickstand so we don't fall back, right? What about cervical vertebra? Yes or no? Did it move? Good. And to prove it moved, that's where we use landmarks, because it is hard to see something that looks like it didn't move, but it did. And so that's why we use landmarks. What shoulder is the batter looking at on the picture on the left? He's looking at his left shoulder. On the picture on the right, is he still looking at his left shoulder? No, he's looking at his right shoulder. Well, unless I'm possessed, the only way to go from looking to my left shoulder to look to my right shoulder is to have right transverse. The possession joke is if I go that way. So you could see how he had to, if he didn't move his cervical, this is what it would look like. Make sense? So I think the lesson here is that you look at the head, you're like, oh, well, the head's still in the same place. Yes, you have to move your neck in order to keep your head at the same place. To keep your eye on the ball, you have to rotate your cervical as your body is trying to rotate. Cool? All right, guys, how about this one? All right, open-ended question. Legs go down, legs go up on the right side. Then legs go down, legs come up on the left side. In other words, I want you to do a few repetitions of this and practice your verbiage of pelvic girdle and trunk motion. I think if you can do this, all right, as he goes here, this is happening and that's happening. As he comes back, this is, if you could go through this, in my opinion, like a cycle of this exercise with the pelvic and trunk, I think you're in a really good position going in to answer questions on the test, okay? All right, guys, just a heads up. Every now and then I'll have former students looking for work, looking to hire people. So I'm going to be posting another job on our class at Instagram page. It's for the stretch zone, looking for anyone to gain hands-on experience with patients personal trainers, PT aspirations, PA, all of the above. So look for that. And if you don't see it, or just feel free to email me, or I'll get you Connor's information. He said part-time or full-time, highly flexible schedule. Yeah, so with a company like the Stretch Zone, I hope to be flexible. All right, guys. It's a fine line between wanting to give more time and wanting to do more examples, right? So let's start with them going down from here. Legs go down. Right transverse pelvic girdle rotation because of left transverse trunk rotation as they go down. Coming back up, left transverse pelvic because of right transverse trunk. If they continue across, still left transverse pelvic because of right transverse trunk. If you wanted to separate it, you could say right transverse trunk to anatomical, and then right transverse trunk from, if you wanted to separate it like that. Then coming back, right transverse pelvic, left transverse trunk. You just keep going back and forth. It's the cap in the bottle. Any follow-up questions to that? Right. How about this one? This is the final boss, pelvic girdle and trunk. The final boss. All right, you guys, let's say, so just to make sure we're all on the same page, in this machine, your upper extremity is fixed. That what she's holding on to, that doesn't move. It's like a pull-up for trunk rotation, okay? So, and in addition, they have one of these in the weight room. In addition, you can reset it to be able to start, whether you want to start lined up or whether you want to start it deviating this way, right? So in her start position, how do I know that's her start position? Because the weights are still touching. They're not, she had to move the plates apart from each other. So I know that this is how she starts. In this start position, she is going to rotate her pelvis, and let's say she ends where it's lined up. In other words, she doesn't take it all the way to the other side. So she goes from this start position to not being twisted. Does that make sense? So talk to me about pelvic girdle rotation and trunk rotation. Starting here, she's not lined up, she's twisted, and then she's going to move until she's not twisted anymore. Here's a hint. Same process as before. First test, we always said position. Why do you think we emphasize position? Where are you at? Where are you at? Where are you at? Where are you at? If you're having a tough time seeing the motion, start with position. How is her trunk positioned? How is she twisted when she started? I already gave you the final destination. She won't be twisted when she finishes. So if you could establish how she's twisted to start, and you know the end, then the motion is given to you. Sorry. I press play, she starts moving, right transverse pelvic rotation, left transverse frontal rotation. Now, why this is so important? So important, because eventually we're going to get into muscles. Muscles influence motion in the context of contractions. It's a lot of variable. So if we can't identify motions correctly, then we're going to amplify that error when we get into muscles and contractions. It's so important to at least get the first variable right. Because when you can't get the motion right, then the muscles and the contraction, all these different variables, that's why we get stuck by saying cool. Because when we really don't know, we just say cool. But specific rehab, there may be, like, has anybody ever heard of so-and-so pulled an oblique, right? That's a general thing. Okay, great. Which one? I need to know, is it right external, left internal, right internal? Because each of those things do different things in different planes, and I need to know what's indicated and what's contraindicated for that rehab or therapy. We have to know the specifics. Any follow-up questions before I give you your next one? All right, this should be fun. All right, guys, let's go up and then down. Yoink. Open-ended question. Whatever you see a lot of, tell me what you saw. Yeah, let's go. Good question. We'll do the whole cycle regardless, but let's start at the top to bottom, then we'll go bottom to top. Good clarification. So the start position is at the top and the finish is on the bottom, but I'd like to go back to where we started to, so let's go bottom. Yeah, top to bottom, and then you go bottom to top. rotation, primarily hip flexion, bilateral hip flexion. She did have some trunk flexion, as you can tell, but that trunk flexion alone won't get her elbows to her knees. The trunk flexion is actually very limited. Because remember, your trunk can move, but you got to protect all the wiring and all the in your body. You have to summate a lot of levels for some significant motion. And then pinky or cervical had some flexion with it too, but the primary motions here that I would ask on a test is pelvic rotation and hip motion. And so think of it like this. And this brings up a great conversation we had the other day. Well, wouldn't her hips be flexed in both photos? And the answer is absolutely. But she's more flexed on the bottom. Does that make sense? So again, if I'm going from Crowley to Lake Charles, both of those positions are west of Lafayette. But Lake Charles is further west. So to go from Crowley to Lake Charles, I still got to. So yeah, she's flexed at the top, but she's more flexed on the bottom. So therefore she had to have hip flexion. She's more flexed on the bottom, less flexed at the top, therefore she had to have some extension. Cool. This one messes with team poor. And so what I would advise you to do, if this is messing with you with team poor, that's P-O-U-R, tilt your head or your device and look at her as if she was upright. And then you could see how the pore would be anterior or posterior. Does that make sense? I'm team spin. I'm team Jacob, Edward, Weiland. They're all. All right, how about one more, huh? Is this helpful? You didn't do policy. Okay, no problem. Top to bottom, anterior pelvic girdle rotation because of bilateral hip flexion. Bottom to top would be posterior pelvic girdle rotation because of bilateral hip extension. Yeah. Again, fun ones. Fun good one. So, I mean, like rods and layers or something. Kind of things. It's not speed, but let's talk about hips. Let's talk about hips. So I think we can identify, I mean, obviously the knees are flexed. There's certain elbows up, it's not fall. But I think the hips, we can talk about hip position sagittally, hip position from the pelvic girdle's transverse position, perspective, the horizontal. And then the one that I really would love for you to look at before class is over, and that's the femur's perspective of rotation. How are they rotated? Okay, so let's have that conversation. Do we have enough clues? Yes, we do. To be able to say how the hips are rotated and how the hips are positioned horizontally abducted, flexed, extended, and then internally or externally rotated. Ready, go.
What I'll do is give that scroll, especially upward, because we have now the last of the were, so if that's a thought, that'd be homework. Some examples of the first half class and last halves. So yeah, we probably need to do a lot of this stuff. This is the last one.
All right, you guys. Lindsay got a good one that we want to do before we cut out. So can everybody see how the hips in terms of, and again, on the test, I'll say, how are the hips positioned? And then I'll give options that may have rotated internally or externally rotated in it. The hips would be externally rotated. That's the key. The key is for me to teach you and you to learn, which you are, that just because the feet come in doesn't mean my hips rotated in. My hips had to rotate out so that the feet can come in. Cool. The other ones, the hips would have to be flexed because the pelvis is here. The hips would be horizontally abducted position. But the one I really, if I would ask this question, it would be specifically about how the hips are rotated and seeing if you guys remember that just because the feet come in doesn't mean the hips didn't scat. All right, here's from Lindsay's diabolical mind. Oh, look, there's a stretch for you. There's a little bit of stretching in real time. We analyze joint by joint. We do not assume that includes the hips. We can't assume they're both doing the same thing. Like in the other picture, they did the same thing. We can't always assume it. So we got to analyze them piece by piece. I would do this one for you guys, but I kind of like for my hips to stay intact today.
Yeah, they're both. No,
To the pie. The right hip is flexed and blank. The left hip is abducted and blank. And the ones that I left out blank were the rotated parts. That's what I'm trying to get you to identify. The right hip is flexed and blank. And the left hip is abducted and blank. Of the right hip, bless you, bless you, bless you. Externally rotated. The right hip is externally rotated. Guys, don't, and I know y'all are my regulars, come here all. Don't mistake the room's left from her left or her right. You know, we have to make sure it's from her perspective. Her right hip is externally rotated, her left hip is internally rotated. Cool? Any follow-up questions? Lindsay and I are going to try to come up with some more practice stuff, especially upper extremity. But feel free to come with some questions and stuff for Monday's class review, okay? Y'all have a good day, guys.